They didn't just want him dead. They wanted him erased, piece by agonizing piece. His body, his memory, his name, his defiance, his very existence. So they inflicted a suffering where death became mercy, dragged him through the streets like meat, hung him by the neck but kept him alive. But if their goal was to wipe him from history forever, then why do we still remember his name 700 years later? Does that mean they didn't succeed? What made William Wallace dangerous enough to deserve a punishment worse than death? And what does it say about the world that tried to silence him? The people of London gathered like they were coming to a festival. Vendors shouted. Children climbed onto barrels for a better view. There was laughter, chatter, and excitement in the atmosphere. But this wasn't a celebration. It was a life-stripping ceremony. August 23, 1305. A man was about to be turned into a message, William Wallace. Dragged through the filthy streets behind a horse, his body tied tight, flesh scraping the cobblestones, a rough rope grinding at his throat, but not enough to finish him. They didn't want him dead yet. They wanted the people to see, to learn. His face was swollen, blood dried against bruises, but his eyes weren't pleading. They weren't broken. He didn't put forward any resistance, just a kind of stillness you only see in men who already made peace with the end. And maybe he had. Maybe Wallace had known for years this would be the cost. Not a sword in battle, not a soldier's death, but this, a public stage, every detail scripted, every scream planned. Guards lined the route like props. Clergy stood nearby like witnesses. The executioners were actors with their own cues. And Wallace, he was the centerpiece, the symbol, the rebel-turned lesson. The smell of sweat, horse-dung, cheap ale, and anticipation hung thick in the air. Every footstep toward the gallows was another step deeper into a carefully designed performance. They were about to break his meaning and drown his legacy under the sound of jeers and steel. But something different was definitely playing in his mind. Was he going over memories, his men, his losses? Did he think of betrayal, of how he'd been handed over by fellow Scots for gold and mercy? Or did he already understand something the crowd didn't, that this wasn't the end, that sometimes a man becomes more powerful when you silence him? If you knew your death would be used to scare millions, would you try to die with silence too, or would you scream, just to remind the world you were still human? Let's go back a bit before this day. Wallace didn't wake up one day ready to kill kings. He woke up watching people he loved being crushed, slowly and legally. Long before the gallows, before the sword, William Wallace was just a boy, born into a land that was no longer truly his. Scotland at the time wasn't a nation, it was a possession, an uneasy prize clutched in the hands of a king across the border. Wallace's father, a minor landowner, possibly a knight, died when William was still young. Not peacefully, not in bed. He died fighting, because in 13th century Scotland, that was often the only way you left this world as a man with dignity. And from that point on, life for Wallace wasn't just about surviving. It was about watching everything around him be swallowed, not by armies with swords, but by documents, taxes, laws written in languages not his own, English sheriffs taking what they wanted, land, food, women, and calling it order. Rebellion didn't start with swords. It started with mothers hiding sacks of grain, with farmers whispering names in the dark, with fugitives passed through barns at night, their faces cloaked and shivering. William was raised on that silence, on fear stitched into daily life. Did he love anyone? Some say he loved Marion Braidfute. Others say she may not have existed. History doesn't care to confirm her, and maybe that's the point. Whether she was real or not, What she represented was a home, a reason, a face to fight for when everything else had been taken. Wallace wasn't a born warrior. He wasn't bred in armor or schooled for war. He studied Latin, logic, and the art of thought. He knew the law better than many who enforced it. But intelligence didn't protect his people. Politeness didn't keep English boots off Scottish necks. So eventually, he picked up a sword, not because he wanted to, but because every other door had been closed. He fought not to take power, but to take space, to carve out a pocket of freedom in a land where freedom had become illegal. And maybe that's what made him dangerous. He wasn't chasing a crown, he was protecting a life, a language, a memory of what it meant to be free before someone else redefined the word. It started like a whisper, then rolled like thunder across the hills. Stirling Bridge, 1297. Two forces faced each other on the banks of the River Forth. The English, well-armed and confident, marched in formation, heavy with armor and certainty. They outnumbered Wallace's forces, outtrained them. They had cavalry, siege weapons, nobles on horseback with bloodlines and banners. Wallace had farmers, blacksmiths, men who had never held a sword until their homes were burned down. But what they had was fire, and Wallace, he didn't fight like a nobleman. He fought like a man with nothing left to lose. He watched the English begin to cross the narrow bridge, a trap that was part of the plan. He waited, then gave the signal. The Scots charged from the trees. Steel met flesh. The bridge collapsed in chaos. Men drowned in armor too heavy to save them. Panic spread. The mighty English line shattered, not by force but by timing. And in that moment, Wallace wasn't just a rebel, he was a symbol. They made him guardian of Scotland, not king but protector. A title that carried weight far heavier than gold. Because what he guarded wasn't a throne, it was belief. For the first time in years, Scots began to believe they could choose their own fate. That maybe they could push back the tide. The heartbeat got louder. But freedom sometimes isn't a victory. It's more like a threat, and empires respond to threats with fire. Edward I, known as Longshanks, didn't see a rebel. He saw an infection, one that had to be cut out, slowly and publicly. This wasn't just about Scotland anymore. It was about control, about making sure no one anywhere in the empire got the same idea. And for Wallace, the walls were closing in, the people loved him. But love doesn't stop betrayal, and power rarely protects those who reject it. The fire that had ignited at Stirling was now drawing every storm cloud toward it. If you were an empire built on control, how would you kill an idea? With a sword? With an army? No. You'd kill it with memory, with fear, with a brutal spectacle such that no one would dare repeat it. That's what Edward I understood better than most. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He didn't twist his mustache or revel in cruelty for its own sake. He was dangerous. He was rational, a king obsessed with unity, not emotional unity, but structural. Borders, taxes, obedience, everything in its place. Scotland to him wasn't a country. It was a missing piece in a puzzle he believed was already his, and Wallace to him was a glitch in the system, an anomaly, not just for what he did, but for what he represented. He wasn't a nobleman. He wasn't sanctioned by the crown. He rose from below, and that was intolerable. You can crush noble uprisings with diplomacy and titles. But when the fire starts in the dirt, among the common people, it spreads in ways you can't predict. So the English didn't see William Wallace as a man anymore. They saw him as a threat to the idea of empire itself. And in empires, threats aren't reasoned with, they're erased. First came the manhunt, not a soldier's battle, but a spy's game. Whispers, bribes, betrayal. Then, finally, capture. not in battle but through treachery, turned over by those who once called him brother, and once he was in English hands, it wasn't enough to kill him. He had to be dismantled, publicly, slowly, symbolically, because Edward wanted to send a message to every farmhand, every stonemason, every barefoot child in Scotland that this is what happens when you defy the crown. If you were him, a ruler balancing an empire, would you have done anything different? Or does keeping power always mean breaking someone? He kept fighting. Even after Stirling, even after the fire began to fade, Wallace didn't vanish into legend. He became the shadow in the woods, a whisper in the glens. Leading a guerrilla war the English couldn't fully pin down. No grand armies, just raids, disruption, strike and vanish, bleed the empire dry one wound at a time, but even fire needs fuel. Then came Falkirk, 1298. The English came back in force, archers, cavalry, heavy infantry. Wallace's men fought with grit, but they were outmatched. The Chiltern formations shattered under longbow fire. The line broke, and the dream cracked with it. Wallace survived, but something inside the movement didn't. He resigned as guardian of Scotland. The cause, once so unified under his defiance, now split into factions. Noble houses turned inward. Some plotted, some submitted. Others just wanted the bloodshed to stop. And Wallace? He left, not to run, but to find help. He travelled abroad, France, perhaps even Rome, seeking aid, legitimacy, anything to keep the flame alive. But the thrones of Europe weren't eager to antagonize Edward, and Wallace returned home not with an army, but with silence. The war was still burning, but fewer hands were feeding it. And then it happened. Near Glasgow, John de Menteith, a fellow Scot, a man Wallace likely knew, turned him over to the English, in a quiet arrangement sealed in shadows, and it wasn't just a man who sold him out. It was exhaustion, it was division, it was the slow poison of hopelessness. Years of war, crops ruined, families torn, a dream that had once united the poor and proud, now weighed down by politics, fear, and fatigue. Wallace wasn't captured by force. He was surrendered by a country too tired to keep believing. And as he was chained and taken south, through forests he once defended, past villages that once fed him in secret, the people watched, but most stayed silent, not because they hated him, but because hope had become too heavy to carry. Westminster Hall, London, 1305, a place built for pageantry, for royal decrees and the illusion of justice. But that day, it wasn't a court. It was a theatre. William Wallace stood in chains, surrounded by men in robes and armour, eyes filled with judgment, not questions. They called it a trial. But there was no jury, no defence, no chance. The outcome had been carved in stone before his feet touched English soil. Still, he stood tall, thin from captivity. Beaten but unbent. When they accused him of treason, he didn't beg, he didn't weep, he simply spoke. I never swore allegiance to Edward, not a plea, not an excuse. A reminder. How could a man betray a king he never acknowledged? How could a Scotsman betray a foreign crown that ruled his land by force? But they weren't there to hear reason. They were there to check a box, to finalize the paperwork of power. The charges were read like a script: murder, insurrection, war against the crown. The sentence was inevitable: death, by hanging, drawing, and quartering, to show every man, woman, and child what defiance looks like when the empire's done with you. Can law mean anything when the verdict is already written? Because the courtroom was built to perform and not listen. Wallace didn't win his trial, but he didn't lose his voice either. He refused to kneel, and sometimes, in a room full of puppets, Standing still is its own kind of rebellion. They hanged him, but not to end his life quickly. They wanted him to feel each moment, a slow reminder that mercy was not on offer. Next, they took from him what made him whole, a deliberate act meant to strip away dignity and send a clear message to those watching. Resistance would not be tolerated. Then they took his head, not just to finish the sentence, but to erase the man behind the defiance, to turn a person into a symbol of warning. Finally, they divided his body into 4 parts, sending them to distant cities across the land, a way to scatter his presence, and remind everyone what happens to those who stand against the crown. Their goal was to erase him completely. But the crowd didn't scream, they didn't cheer, they watched quietly, and in that silence something else took hold. Memory, a spark that would outlast any attempt to silence him. They thought they could make him vanish. Instead, they made sure no one would ever forget William Wallace. Before the legend, before the execution, there was the man. A man who laughed in the woods with his comrades, sharing stories under cold stars, finding moments of light in dark times. A man who heard whispers of doubt, "We can't win," and answered not with despair but with resolve, "Then we'll die trying." To the villagers who lived in his shadow, Wallace wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a distant hero carved in stone. He was the one who stayed when others fled, the one who refused to bow, the one who carried their hopes on his shoulders, even when the weight was almost too much. His death wasn't just a loss to politics or kingdoms, it was a hole in the hearts of people who needed him, a silence where a voice used to be. That absence lingered long after the crowds dispersed, and it's in that silence we begin to understand what it truly means to lose a man like William Wallace. After Wallace's death, the fight didn't end. It passed on, picked up by Robert the Bruce, a man who carried the flame forward. Scotland didn't just survive. It eventually won its independence. Wallace's name didn't fade. It grew, turned into a myth, a rallying cry whispered in secret. They cut him into pieces, but he multiplied. Today, statues stand where he once walked. Stories are told in films bringing his struggle into the modern world. It's not about glorifying battle or bloodshed. It's about remembering what it means to resist. The question isn't whether Wallace won. It's why they were so afraid he might. What is it about one man, one idea that can shake an empire to its core? And maybe that's the story that still matters most. What is freedom? Is it the absence of chains or the presence of choice? Can a violent act, no matter how brutal, truly silence a memory? When a man like William Wallace falls, is it the end of the story or just the beginning? What does it mean to live in a world where speaking truth is punished and obedience is rewarded, where the voices that challenge power are pushed to the edges, while those who follow without question are praised? Every empire claims it brings order, but order built on fear. That order is fragile. It is already cracking from within, because ideas, especially ones born in silence, carried quietly in the hearts of the people, can't be killed. They spread like wildfire beneath the ashes, waiting for a wind to carry them back into the light. And maybe that's why, 700 years later, we still remember William Wallace, not because he was perfect, not because he was invincible, but because he dared to stand. And no empire, no matter how powerful, can erase that. If stories like William Wallace's move you, if you feel that pull to understand the past, to see the world not just as it is, but as it was and could be, then this channel is for you, because here we don't just retell history. We uncover the voices they tried to silence. We shine light on the shadows, so you can see the truth behind the myths. Subscribe and join a community that refuses to forget, that refuses to settle for surface answers, that wants to feel the weight of history and use it to understand today.